Hey everyone, this is Joe Mayers. Welcome to Think Forever Behind the Scenes. In these episodes, I am joined by special guests to discuss the historical, cultural, and scriptural significance of the stories we tell on the podcast. This week, we have guest author Laura Findley Evans here to talk about her story of Lydia and how each of us can use our unique gifts to serve the kingdom of God. Welcome, everyone, to this behind-the-scenes episode of the Think Forever podcast. I'm Joe Mayers, your host, and I am joined today by guest author Laura Findley Evans. She is a retired educator and now a full-time author. She has a fantasy series that book 2 is coming out very soon. She is a mother, a grandmother, and most importantly to me, Aunt Laura. I am blessed to have an amazing author in the family. So Aunt Laura, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm really excited to talk with you today about the writing process, just because I have learned so much from you about writing and storytelling throughout the course of my life. I think my love of reading came from a sleepover that I had at your house, and you told me I could stay up as long as I wanted, but the only thing I could do was read. And I don't know if you quite understood how badly I wanted to stay up late when I was a child, because I think I finished the book. But you've inspired that in me. Tell me a little bit about the kind of writing that you usually do before we jump into this story.
Well, I've always been a fiction writer, and what that means is it's about story that isn't necessarily real. Not a how to build an airplane or anything like that. But when I write story, I want it to be true. And I know that sounds weird, but the idea of seeking to find truth in fiction. And I've been writing stories my whole life, mostly just short story. A few have been published. Wrote my first story when I was 6 years old. But then after I retired, I stumbled into writing a novel, which was very challenging. I always said I was never going to write a novel. And then I ended up writing a novel because my grandkids said one night when they were supposed to be going to sleep, kind of like you,
Yeah.
They said, tell us a story. And so I started telling a story about a little girl who found herself eye to eye with a young dragon in the forest one day. So that's
just begging to be a novel.
It is, and that's how it came to be. That, like you just said, I just finished book 2, and now there's book 3 on the horizon. So
yeah. So you, in exploring that genre, you say that you want it to be true. How do you search for that truth in these stories? Is it cognitive? Is it emotional? Is it something that you plan in advance, or do you just kind of follow the story where it goes and let it lead you?
Yes, I follow the story. I am what is known as a pantster, which means I write by the seat of my pants. And most people think that is very weird. They say, well, don't you plot your whole story out ahead of time? The answer is no. I just sit down and start writing and see where the story takes me. But even within that, I want to incorporate things about life, about people, about situations that is true or somehow reveals what's true about people and interactions and things like that.
So you're keeping the truth of human nature and character alive, regardless of the subject matter.
True.
So what was that like for you, taking your style of writing and bringing it into this genre?
This was a challenge somewhat because, like I said, I tend to sit down and just start writing and see what happens. But in this case, I had some givens.
Mm-hmm.
Not a lot, but some givens. We knew her name. We knew Lydia's name. We knew a few things about her. And then, so what it led me to do is try to kind of sit back and think, okay, what would she have been like based on what we do know about her? What might she have been like as a little girl? And what kinds of things might have happened to her before we meet her in this passage that led her to be the way she was, to respond the way she did.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a lot of thinking and wandering around. I tend to go on little walks around my house when I get stuck, and
Little pacing.
Yeah, just walking around, thinking, taking some notes, doing some reading. I tried really hard not to read too much about what other people have said about her, because I wanted this to definitely be a story that God guided me to write. And I prayed a lot. I did. I prayed a lot about how God could lead me to really get at the truth, really, of the story of Lydia and her experience and what that must have been. So in some ways, I did the pantster thing, like the flashback to her childhood was me just starting to write about what might have happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that's kind of confusing, but that's just the way I write.
I found a lot of elements of the story surprising and delightful in that way. And tell me if I'm wrong here, but what I'm seeing is that all of your years, both teaching and writing, has made you a student of human nature and the way that people get to be the way that they are.
That's
and
true.
So as you're looking at these characters, I think that you may be more attuned to than a lot of people as to, what plausible circumstances might have led them to that place.
Absolutely.
And so seeing Lydia in sort of a different light than we usually do, because if you've read the Bible, you've probably seen the name, but we don't really know why it's there necessarily. We understand that it's a character and it's a plot point, but oftentimes she's just a name that's surrounding this story of Paul and Silas in prison.
Yes.
And so this was more of a look at her. So one of the things that I'm curious about is what drew you to this story in particular? And follow-up question, why does it matter?
I think what really drew me to this character is it says about her when she's talking to Paul and the others after she has been baptized, she invites them to come stay with her at her home. And they tell her, in my mind, they say no. They demur because the idea of you're supposed to be independent and not lean on other people for help.
Not be a burden on anybody.
And what it says in the Bible is she prevailed upon us.
Mm-hmm.
I love that phrase. And I did a little research and looked at other versions of the Bible, and sometimes that's translated as persuaded, urged us until we agreed.
Mm-hmm.
She's not taking no for an answer. She constrained us. And so this idea, this is not just she invited us and talked us into it. She's so strong. And that, I don't mean bullying, but she's got this backbone of steel, which I love. And so this idea, she prevailed upon us. And they did. They stayed with her, it says, for many days.
Mm-hmm.
And that put her in the middle of what comes next in the story.
Yeah.
Because they were staying with her.
Well, I love not only that phrase prevailed upon us. I had never stopped to consider that before, what that really meant, that they were opposed and she won. And so I think that says something about her nature. Obviously as a very successful businesswoman, that's a trait that you would assume that she would have. But it also says something about the value, I think, that she was placing on this faith.
Yes.
And the fact that her first inclination immediately after that was to be generous, with everything that she had. She's giving up her home and privacy to care for these people. And so not only is she hugely successful, but she's hugely generous.
And if you think about Paul, I think about Paul as being very strong. You know, there's so much we know about him from his writing and the stories that we've heard about him. And so you see these two standing face to face. And, you know, maybe he realized how important it was that he do say yes, that he does go and stay. And like in the story, I kind of thought, well, maybe he glanced over at his compadres and thought, oh man, a place to stay and get cleaned up and eat and relax and rest and refresh ourselves and have a base here in Philippi. So maybe that was part of it too. But boy, she wasn't going to take no for an answer.
Yeah, man, I love that imagery of seeing somebody like Paul, who's just this staple, or somebody that we see as a giant in the faith because of Scripture, and just being like, yeah, well, you know what, she won that one. That's really cool to think about. This was something that I was excited to talk specifically with you about, because I think that you like this aspect of writing. What were some of your favorite bits of language or themes that you got to incorporate into the story?
The themes, I really felt like I tried to get in here, and this is kind of a long answer, I think.
That's
First of all, what I really love about what you're doing with these podcasts and zeroing in on individual people, I love that, because I think sometimes we as Christians don't think that we can possibly do anything that's all that meaningful in the kingdom of God. I know I feel that way sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not in ministry like you are. I'm not a preacher. How can I really make a difference? And I think what God has caused to happen in the Bible is that we get these specific names, not just a woman, but names. We have Lydia, we have Rahab, we have Onesiphorus, we have Simon the Tanner. And we get these names, and I think what that does is signal to us that we can make a difference. And we may not even know what the outcome will be. You know, did Lydia really know what her impact would be? She basically provided a base and a support for the first Christian church in Europe. I mean, that was a big deal. I think that helps us when we're thinking about themes. To get way more personal, I am a grandmother, as I mentioned. We won't say how old, but when we're very young and when we're older, we start to feel a little bit invisible. We start to feel like, okay, what impact can I have? You know, sometimes I think people don't think that older people can really make a difference or have anything important to say. When I studied and prayed about who Lydia was, I see her as being an older woman. You know, it's likely that she was a widow. You know, we don't know for sure, but it's likely that she was. I think of her as being older. And so here, how awesome. You know, she's still strong and she's experienced, she has wisdom, and she has knowledge, and she uses all of that. And so I tried to get the theme of that in there as well, that even though she looks at herself in the mirror and sees, oh my gosh, who is this old woman? She still can impact and make a difference.
Yeah. So I want to go back to something that you had said previously about getting these individual names and how that can signal to us that there are things for people to do in everyday life that have significance for the kingdom. And I think that the common thread throughout those things is that in the moments that are recorded, those people were not focused just on what was in front of them. They had this eternal mindset. They had that perspective. You know, for Lydia, she had received something she had been waiting for her whole life. And her response was one of strength and of generosity. And one of the things that I really liked that you did was showing that throughout her life. Was that something that you built in there intentionally, or am I reading into it too far?
Well, it started out with the backstory. And again, as I mentioned, I kind of did a little pantser thing on that. I just all of a sudden had this picture of her as a little girl. And, she lived in Thyatira. I'm saying it wrong. Anyway.
I had to look it up on YouTube.
So she lived there and probably was part of a family that had money, that had some influence. We know that they were purveyors of purple goods, which were extremely rare, extremely valuable, and that's where the wealth came from. But she experiences this bullying, is what it was, from these older boys. But the whole thing about this stick god, this little thing that these boys had made out of twigs and dirty cloth and made other kids bow down to and give gifts, little coins, they were basically extorting money from kids in the marketplace. And she has this experience where she's face to face in the dust with this stick god. I think at that moment, God had already prepared her to realize, how can this thing have any power? How could anything made of gold or silver or anything that they had all over the area at that point, that was that seed that was planted in her by God to see that this isn't real. These aren't powerful things. At that moment, what I was trying to show is that she had to be prepared. God had to plant in her heart. And we know even before Paul showed up, she had become what they called a God worshiper, a God-fearer. So she had already been somewhat open to that. And then someone or a group of people, probably these women she prayed with, helped her see there is one true God. And that must have really resonated with her. So she was prepared. Her heart was ready to hear what Paul had to say and share, and immediately received him and wanted to be baptized.
Yeah. Well, I thought that aspect in storytelling and in showing how she had been prepared for that for her whole life, I thought that was powerful. And you're right. We don't know for sure what her story was, but that's the fun and the beauty of this genre, is that we can sort of be imaginative and say, what was that maybe like, and leading into that portion of the story that we do know.
Right.
So you mentioned earlier the idol worship in the city she was from and the expense of the purple goods. Are there any other cultural specifics that you came across that would be good for us to understand as we consider the story of Lydia?
One of the things that I wondered about was why they were going to the river to pray. And I started wondering, well, okay, she's hanging out with presumably Jewish women who have talked to her about God. And why aren't they in a synagogue? I started wondering about that. Well, one of the things I found out was, in order to have a synagogue, you had to have 10 Jewish men or more. And so the implication of that is that there weren't 10 Jewish men yet in Philippi. And so they had this place by the river. And another thing that I read in my little journey here was that there was probably some sort of little building, but we don't know. And so in my mind, I pictured it as being more, they were hanging out along the edge of this stream. One thing that's really fun is that my sister, your mother, actually has been to this little river in Philippi. And she has a photo that she took of it meandering with all the greenery around it, the trees and plants. And that was kind of like, oh yeah, where there's water, there's going to be this beautiful green, lush vegetation growing.
That's some beautiful imagery.
I thought, okay, there might have been some place there for them to pray, but maybe they were just, on slabs of stone sitting and praying.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was perfect, again, the way God works. It was perfect for an immediate baptism. It doesn't say immediately they were baptized, but it most likely was pretty immediate.
Yeah.
And she made sure her whole household got baptized.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another cultural thing that I read, that was something that was just sort of done. If the head of a household came to believe in whatever, then the whole rest of the household went along.
That's what the whole household was doing.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. It's always fun to dive deep into something that you wouldn't normally.
Absolutely.
And just learn a couple things like that are just fun little tidbits. Well, I don't know what party you'd be at where you could whip those facts out, but it's fun to know.
Another thing I researched a little bit is what that beating that Paul and Silas received must have been like. It's easy for our eyes to just sort of read over this little line. Their garments were torn off and they were flogged, and then they were sent to be imprisoned. Well, I did a little bit of reading, dark and scary reading, about what it was like to be beaten like that, to be flogged like that. It was brutal.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't a little spanking. It was a terrible beating that they received based on, nothing. They hadn't been convicted of anything, but the magistrates wanted to appease the crowd. Sounds very familiar.
Yeah.
I started thinking a lot about what that must have been like to watch. And Lydia was there and saw this.
Mm-hmm.
And then thinking about what her response to that would be, knowing a little bit more about who we think she might have been.
Yeah, I loved seeing her response after that, knowing from your story what we know about that version of her, that she's strong, she's generous, she's a caretaker, she has the means. And so rather than running away and being scared, what she chooses to do is be the caretaker.
Right.
And provide that place for people to go. This portion wasn't in your story, but it's one of my favorite things about her. Immediately following that, in the Bible, we have the story of Paul and Silas in jail. And that's the story where they're singing hymns, and then the doors of the jail swing open, and the jailer comes down, and he thinks that they're gone, and he's about to kill himself because he thinks that they've escaped.
Right.
And they say, no, don't. We're still here. Doors opened up. We were singing, and it happened. And then he and his whole household get saved. And then ultimately Paul and Silas are let go. I'm not going to give a spoiler alert to that, because if you haven't read that for the last couple thousand years, it's probably on you. But, but once they're let go, there's this line that almost seems like a throwaway line before the next chapter starts. And they're leaving. It says, and then we went and visited Lydia, and then we left.
Right.
And she was important enough of a staple, and most likely the place where that entire new church was spending their time, that's where they went. She was the hub
right.
of that. And it was so cool to see what she did in the face of something that was truly terrifying.
Right. In her mind, I'm sure she's thinking, I could be thrown in jail. I could be in trouble. My business could be in big trouble because I'm associating with these troublemakers in town. And, but, and this is another thing I tried to make sure came through in the story, is that she had decided ever since she was a young girl and got bullied that she was never going to be a coward again.
Mm-hmm.
She wasn't going to let anybody scare her away from what she knew was the right thing to do.
Yeah. So here's the big question. So what? And what I mean by so what is, this is a wonderful story with great language and themes. It's imaginative. I think it moved me, and I think it'll move other people as well. But what do we do with it? What does this passage teach us about the nature of God? What can we learn? And how can we hold on to that and grow ourselves?
I already did mention a little bit about how I feel like we all can look at her and realize that we can be used and used in very powerful ways that we may not understand ourselves, even when it's happening. So we already talked somewhat about that. But again, this idea that I don't know what impact I can have on somebody. Just this idea of being open and willing and trusting that God will use us. And I think that she was strong and open and willing, and I want to be like her. I feel like I learned a lot from that. The Bible is such an amazing thing. It's so relevant to us today. These are not just old stories about old people. I mean, she was real. Lydia, in this story, it's a lot of it's fictionalized, but she was a real person. These people in these stories were real people, flesh and blood, just like we are. And God used them and continues to use people today. And we just need to be open and willing to pray about it and dig in and do even scary things. Speak up when it's not comfortable, for example, with others.
I think you did a great job of lifting her off the page and making her look real. And I was encouraged too that not just that we can all be used, but we can all be used with our unique skill set.
Yes.
Things that we have cultivated over the course of our lives, that it's not just plug someone into a random assignment, but we each have unique gifts that God can and will use if we are willing to seize those opportunities, just like Lydia did.
Yes.
Because she didn't have to offer them a place to stay, right?
And once they said no once, she could have said, oh, okay, well, I tried.
Yeah. And the way that the prevailed upon it phrase makes it seem is that it was her idea. She really convinced them that was the best plan.
Yes.
And that wasn't something that she had to do, but she had in that moment, she was changed and she looked at her resources and her skills and she said, this is what I'm going to do. And she seized that moment. And because she did that, she's remembered forever in Scripture.
Yeah.
Well, Laura, I'm so glad that not only that you wrote this story, but that we get to have this conversation. Before we go, I want to know for everybody listening, what projects are you working on right now? When will those be available and where can we find them?
Well, out on wherever books are sold, you can find book 1 of my series. The name of the series is The Dragon and the Girl, and book 1 is called True North. And then, as we've mentioned already, book 2 is finished, at least the first rigorous draft, and it's now at my editor's who's working away at it. My hope is it will be out in the fall. And again, you can find these where books are sold. I am also on social media, Laura Findley Evans, Findley.
I'll put a link to that in the show notes for everybody.
Yes, and so you can follow me and kind of keep up with my journey. I have drawers full of short stories that I work on from time to time. Those are not for kids. Dragon and the Girl is for kids about 8 to 14 or anybody who loves dragons.
Well, I loved that story, so I think people of all ages will love it.
Did you stay up late reading it?
Very late on a couple of occasions.
Good.
All right, Laura, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's all we have for this week. Thanks everyone for listening. If you're enjoying our show, we would love it if you would subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And be sure to listen in next week for an all-new story from Think Forever.